If you grew up in America, you were likely taught a clean, heroic story about December 16, 1773. You were told that a group of freedom-loving colonists dressed up like Native Americans marched down to Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water because they were furious about a brand-new, crushing British tax. It sounds simple, noble, and straight out of a storybook, but almost everything about that textbook version is either a half-truth or a complete myth. The real story isn't just about taxation without representation. It is a tale of a multi-million-dollar corporate bailout, a vast black market smuggling empire, high-level political conflict of interest, and a shadowy alliance between New England's wealthiest criminal elite and street-level agitators. In fact, the British law that triggered the Boston Tea Party didn't raise the price of tea in America. It actually made it cheaper. So why did a group of men break onto 3 merchant ships in the dead of night and destroy nearly $2 million worth of tea in today's money? The answer lies in the hidden economic conspiracy behind the American Revolution. To understand what really happened, you have to look at the Dutch connection. By the 1760s, tea was a daily necessity in colonial America, with colonists consuming over 1 million pounds of it every year. Under British law, colonists were required to buy their tea exclusively from Great Britain, but British tea carried heavy import taxes and markup fees. New England merchants led by John Hancock, the wealthiest man in Boston, saw a massive business opportunity. They began illegally importing cheap Dutch tea, bribing customs officials and running a black market smuggling empire. By 1773, up to 90% of all tea consumed in America was illegal smuggled Dutch tea. John Hancock wasn't just a political idealist, he was running a shadow monopoly that made him astronomically rich. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in London, the most powerful corporation in the world was going broke. The British East India Company had its own private army, controlled vast territories in India, and dominated global trade. But due to corruption, military overextension, and severe famine in Bengal, the company was staring into an economic abyss. They had 18 million pounds of unsold tea rotting in London warehouses and owed massive debts to the Bank of England. If the East India Company collapsed, it would crash the entire British economy. It was the 18th century version of a megacorporation that was simply too big to fail. Since many members of the British Parliament were personal shareholders in the East India Company, they passed the Tea Act of 1773 to save it. This law allowed the company to ship its tea directly to America without paying traditional British export duties or using middlemen merchants. The result was startling. Even with the small remaining 3-penny import tax included, legal East India Company tea was suddenly cheaper than the illegal Dutch tea John Hancock was smuggling into Boston. This created a major crisis for the colonists. First, it threatened to bankrupt colonial smugglers and local merchants who couldn't compete with a Crown-sanctioned corporate monopoly. Second, it set a dangerous legal precedent. If Parliament could grant one corporation a monopoly on tea today, they could do it for paper, glass, or textiles tomorrow. Third, it was a political trap set by the British government. If colonists bought the cheap corporate tea, they would officially be paying the import tax, thereby acknowledging Parliament's legal right to tax them without representation. In response, an underground network known as the Sons of Liberty began planning a coordinated resistance. Led by political organizer Samuel Adams and funded by wealthy merchants, they met secretly in the basement of Boston's Green Dragon Tavern. Their strategy was simple: prevent the East India Company ships from landing their cargo in American ports. In New York and Philadelphia, protesters forced the ships to turn around and sail back to England. In Charleston, the tea was seized by customs and left to rot. But in Boston, the situation turned into a deadly standoff because of Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Governor Hutchinson had a personal financial stake in the outcome. When selecting local merchants to receive and sell the tea, he ensured the lucrative contracts went to his own sons and nephew. When 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor, Hutchinson refused to let them leave without unloading their cargo.
Under British maritime law, the ships had 20 days to pay the duties, setting a strict legal deadline of midnight, December 16, 1773. If the tea wasn't unloaded by then, royal warships would seize it by force. On the evening of December 16th, over 5,000 colonists gathered at Old South Meeting House. When news arrived that Governor Hutchinson had officially denied the ships permission to leave, Samuel Adams stood up and uttered a coded phrase: "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." Immediately, cries echoed through the streets as a highly organized group of men marched toward Griffin's Wharf. Contrary to popular belief, the men did not disguise themselves to fool people into thinking they were actual Native Americans. Smearing soot on their faces and wrapping themselves in blankets was a symbolic gesture of anti-European identity and a practical way to prevent witnesses from recognizing them in court. What followed over the next 3 hours was a disciplined, surgical strike. Between 30 and 100 men boarded the 3 ships in total silence. Working in teams, they hoisted 342 massive wooden chests from the hold, smashed them open with axes, and dumped over 92,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. They didn't steal a single leaf of tea for themselves, nor did they damage any other property on the ships. When a padlock was accidentally broken on one vessel, they quietly returned the next day to replace it. When news of the destruction reached London, the British government reacted with fury. King George III declared that the colonies must either submit or triumph. Parliament responded by passing the Coercive Acts, shutting down Boston Harbor, placing Massachusetts under military control, and forcing citizens to house British soldiers. Instead of isolating Boston, these harsh punishments united the 13 colonies. Within months, representatives met at the First Continental Congress, setting off the chain of events that led straight to the American Revolutionary War. The Boston Tea Party was not an accidental riot by angry taxpayers. It was a masterclass in economic strategy, corporate resistance, and political leverage that transformed a colonial trade dispute into the birth of a nation.